This is the 20th anniversary of Earth Day. And those of us who participated in the first Earth Day 20 years ago, in one sense or another, think back upon it, and we thought at that time that this was indeed a reawakening, a renewal, a resurgence. And we thought that it would be continued. But it lasted all too briefly, and we rapidly fell back into our old and, I think, disastrous ways. But we have another opportunity presenting itself to us on this 20th anniversary of Earth Day. And we have with us this afternoon Denis Hayes, who was responsible, perhaps in a way that no other human being has ever been responsible, of focusing our attention on these problems in a real and meaningful way, and who continues to do that with the hope of growing armies of people around this country and in other places around the world. We're very fortunate, I think, that he's accepted our invitation to be with us this afternoon. 20 years ago, Denis Hayes was recruited by then Senator Gaylord Nelson to be executive director of the first Earth Day. With more than 20 million participants, the resulting event was the largest planned demonstration in history. Its phenomenal success gave birth to the modern U.S. environmental movement. Today, Denis is chairman of Earth Day 1990. His goal is to organize a massive, unprecedented international campaign to propel the environmental movement into a new stage of achievement. Earth Day 1990 will launch the 1990s as the Green Decade. During the 2 decades since the first Earth Day, Denis has practiced law. He's been a guest scholar at the Smithsonian Institute and spent several years as a senior fellow at the World Watch Institute. In the mid-1970s, he was director of the Illinois State Energy Office. During the Carter administration, Denis was director of the Solar Energy Research Institute, then a 1,000-person federal laboratory with an annual budget of $130 million. Would that they had continued. Denis has authored more than 100 publications on environmental subjects. His book, Rays of Hope, The Transition to a Post-Petroleum World, has been translated into 6 languages. He was awarded the 1979 Thomas Jefferson Medal, the highest in the nation for public service by an individual under the age of 35. He is also a recipient of the John Muir Award, the Sierra Club's highest honor for lifetime contributions to the environment. In 1989, Denis received the Environmental Stewardship Award of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. And in 1989, he delivered the Marshall Lecture of the Natural Resources Defense Council. He is currently an adjunct professor of engineering at Stanford. Please join me in welcoming Denis Hayes.
Thank you very much, Maurice. You occasionally get one of these introductions where you wish that you didn't have to get up afterwards because you think there's no place to go but down after that. It's truly wonderful to be here with this most distinguished panel in the world's most exciting city. I'm a Californian these days, in the land of hot tubs and laid-back living. So when I come to New York, I have to do everything I can to get myself wired to the tempo of the city. I propel myself through the morning with many more cups of coffee than I ordinarily will drink in a month. And I also tried to adjust to the fact that last night, New Yorkers seem to have different kinds of concepts of time than other people. Alan, sitting at the table here, called me at 1:15 in the morning and said, "Hi, Denis, it's been 20 years. You remember me?" Great to hear from you again, Alan. But that was one of the calm ones. I got a call at 3 o'clock. I had a call from a reporter in San Francisco at 6:45, which is 3:45 his time. So I arrived a little bit late here for lunch today because I'd gone back up to my room before to really prepare for the talk, which is to say to take a shower, try to wake myself up. And New York showers also are terrific for waking yourself up. Every time that anybody in North America flushed his toilet, suddenly I was given a brand new dose of adrenaline. It has been 20 years now since that first Earth Day. 20 years since a whole generation stood up, walked up to the platform, grabbed the microphone, and began to demand sweeping changes in the way that this country does business. They brought a whole new set of values, a whole new vocabulary to the policy-making apparatus of the country. It's been 20 years now, during which time we've passed a raft of legislation. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on environmental issues. We've educated new generations of people, set up whole professions that didn't exist before. In some very real senses, we've worked a revolution in the landscape. And yet, if you look at the major global issues that are facing us today, the major global environmental issues, pretty much across the board, we are in worse shape than we were 20 years ago. And with regard to some of these issues, we are getting into increasingly worse shape at an accelerating rate. After all of this time, after all of this expenditure of money, after all of this energy, this talent, the creativity, the education, it's legitimate to stand back and say, geez, what have we done wrong? What can we do better? If we're going to have another Earth Day in 1990, if this time we're going to have, and I think we will, 100 million people participating in more than 120 countries around the world, what are the lessons that we ought to learn from the first time around? I'm going to give you the benefit of my latest thinking on this. This is the thinking that I scribbled down on a taxi cab driving back from a foundation meeting this morning about what seemed to be the principal mistakes that I think we've made, and also what I think we've now learned that will enable us this next time to do better. The first of these we can deal with relatively rapidly because there's not much that you can do about it. Problems snuck up on us that we just didn't know about. At the time of that first Earth Day in 1970, nobody knew that CFCs destroyed the ozone layer. We kind of thought that there was an ozone problem, but we thought it was nitrogen oxides that would be deposited in high-flying aircraft that would be causing it, and we used that to beat the SST. I think that was the right campaign. I think we should not have built that airplane for a variety of reasons, but it turns out now that nitrogen oxides are not the big problem, that there are a variety of other far more potent chemicals, and the most important of them are CFCs. It wasn't until 1974 that was discovered to even be a theoretical possibility by Sherry Rowland, Professor Sherwood Rowland and his colleagues at the University of California at Irvine, where in a laboratory they showed that if you knock the chlorine off of a CFC with ultraviolet radiation, it'll start catalyzing ozone in a series of reactions producing oxygen, and that the typical chlorine atom will destroy about 100,000 ozone molecules before it bumps into another chlorine atom and forms a stable molecule again. A process that on average will take place over the course of about 100 years. From the time that we emit some ozone at the surface of the Earth till it gets into the stratosphere where it does this damage takes, again, on average, about 15 years. It gets up there and it's going to continue to wreak havoc for a century. That means that everything that we're measuring today in the ozone layer is being caused by CFCs that were emitted before 1974, when we first discovered that this was a theoretical possibility. This is one of the big problems that we're going to be facing time after time after time, that we will, and it'll race its way through my remarks again many times as well, that we will be discovering things that are very important, only very late. And it leads to a fundamental policy issue having to do with the burden of proof. Do we have to prove beyond any reasonable doubt harm from new things that are being introduced into the environment, or should the burden of proof for a lot of things really be the other side, that there should be a burden to prove that they are safe if these are in fact things capable of wreaking global destruction? Lots of other examples of problems that snuck up on us. Asbestos is one. It was a miracle fiber for the longest time, just like CFCs. I mean, they were miracle drugs. In 1970, if you'd asked people, if you'd asked industrial chemists, name a half dozen real triumphs of modern industry, CFCs would have been on most people's short lists, useful for a wide variety of purposes. They're non-carcinogenic, non-mutagenic, non-toxic, non-corrosive, non-flammable, non-explosive. They're wonderful compounds. It's just that they eat ozone if they get up into the stratosphere. Similarly, asbestos, wonderful compounds with absolutely unparalleled desirable properties that unfortunately cause asbestosis. And with a lot of these things, they go through a vague period where you really don't know the impact. The big controversial one at the moment may be EMF. What are the impacts of electromagnetic fields? Are we really safe underneath power lines and in front of computer terminals and the other places where we're subjected to this kind of radiation? It's a serious dispute. It's hindered, in fact, by the Reagan administration's defunding a major epidemiological study that by now would have been producing some fairly conclusive results about the impacts of various such fields. To save less than $100,000 a year, they stopped that study just like they stopped most other epidemiological studies that had to do with these kinds of controversial issues. They just didn't want to know. So now we don't know. Consumer Reports felt sufficiently confident in December to issue a warning to all pregnant women, do not sleep under electric blankets. But we really don't know. And for a lot of these issues, there's that kind of a problem. It is sneaking up on us, and it will be late before we know the truth. Second big problem that we faced is that an awful lot of environmental issues are really distant threats on the horizon. They are lines that are going to be crossing on graphs 15 or 20 or 25 or 50 years from now. And that's not the kind of stuff that we Americans are very good at addressing. We are what boxers call a counterpuncher. We take the blow and we respond to it in a way that makes the one who threw the blow wish that he'd not thrown it. You bomb Pearl Harbor, America gets going. You launch a Sputnik, America gets going. We're not so good at trying to anticipate problems and take the necessary steps to make sure that they never occur. And yet, in the environmental field, almost without exception, those are the truly important problems, the ones that are threshold problems, the ones that once you cross the line, you can't come back. Things such as the destruction of acres of tropical rainforest. Once you've cut it down, you've cultivated some row crops, you've lost your topsoil, a process that typically in a place like Brazil will all take place within about 5 to 8 years. You can't go back. That tropical rainforest is gone forever. The species that existed within it are gone forever. We're now losing them. This is the ultimate threshold, the disappearance of a species. We are now losing species at the rate of about 1 an hour. You can't go back. Some of them being species that we don't even know, but they may have enormous potential benefits to us, either directly to us as human beings or indirectly to us as part of that vast, intricate web of life that supports the marvelous complexity of the biosphere that we inhabit. We've crossed a lot of these thresholds directly as human beings historically, tracing back to our earliest years. You all, when you were in high school or your first part of college, read about the Fertile Crescent. Probably sparked some synapses that haven't been fired for some of you like me for a quarter of a century. It was an area between the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. The name implies what it was good at. It was the Fertile Crescent, the place where mankind first began developing those huge agricultural surpluses that allowed us the luxury of being playful, of being able to get out and do something other than simply scrounge from the beginning of the day until nightfall in order to survive. It's where we invented the wheel. It's where the first known writing occurred. It's where a whole series of hugely unsustainable agricultural processes resulted in the rapid salination of the soil and the destruction of what had then been by far the most agriculturally productive region of the world and turned it into what is today some of the most barren and inhospitable land on earth. What was then the Fertile Crescent is now southern Iraq. Same sort of thing happened in North Africa. It was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, where these huge grain surpluses were produced year after year to feed the Roman legions as they coursed throughout the known world. Again, we crossed a threshold that was irreversible. Last year, North Africa imported more than 50% of all of the grain that it consumed. And the Sahara is spreading north and spreading south. Some of you have seen over the course of the last 10 days the latest famine in Ethiopia, a problem that received a huge amount of attention a few years ago, and that spike of famine is recurring one more time. And it's not an accident. It's a country that has undermined the basic productivity of its soil to the extent that it simply cannot produce enough food in perpetuity in a sustainable fashion to meet the needs of its current population. Everyone talks about everything being connected to everything else, everything being part of one fabric. We've learned a great deal from various theories that show, at least in concept, that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Brazilian rainforest might in fact have a nice causal relationship to storms that occur up in North America. It's a huge interrelated thing that genuinely has interrelated impacts. And yet we arrange our government, arrange our research facilities, arrange everything to go in with rifle shots at particular problems and try to solve that problem without exploring with much subtlety what the impacts will be for other areas that surround it. We try to clean up our water in a way that often results in sludge being taken out that's then incinerated and clogs up our air. We clean up our air in ways that pollute the water. We have a bunch of those kinds of things that now are on the threshold once again. I mean, we're all concerned with solid waste, and we're all concerned at this meeting even with litter kinds of issues. One of the big solutions that's being heralded all over the place is biodegradable and photodegradable plastics. For a couple of particular limited applications, medical applications and some other things, there may be some real value there. As a solution to the solid waste problem, the plastic solid waste problem, it seems to me to be far more a big, new, huge problem than a solution. Something that is simply going to be dramatically undermining our ability to recycle other kinds of plastics and think that will be other important negative consequences for the environment. Similarly, with regard to global warming, you see this huge battery of advertisements here and around the world now from the nuclear industry saying global warming is a serious problem, we've got the solution. To the extent that the world jumps off on nuclear power as the solution to global warming, we're going to find ourselves in probably much hotter water than we would be if we just adapted to the warming. There are a huge number of controversial aspects of nuclear. I'm not going to jump into them all here, and it's not something that I want to debate with this kind of an audience, but let me point out just one thing. This is an issue that seems to be getting a huge amount of attention now that I think we need to bear in mind. We as a country cannot pursue as the fundamental answer to our energy problems something that we're unprepared to share with all of the countries around the world. And as just a simple thought exercise, if you were to take the current world population, follow the most ambitious scenarios that anyone has scoped out yet for where it's going to stabilize, that's to say, give it one more doubling and get to about 10 billion people, and there finally stop the growth, and give each of those people 1/3 of the energy budget that Americans currently use, and try to meet the electricity part of that budget with nuclear power, it would result in enough circulation of isotopes, bomb-grade isotopes, out of breeder reactors per year to manufacture 4 million Hiroshima-sized bombs. You can come up with any kind of mechanisms that you want to, but if you're producing 4 million bombs per year worth of plutonium, sending them through transportation systems, putting them in the hands of sovereign states, running them through ports that are often controlled by elements of organized crime, exposing them to the vagaries of terrorist organizations, maybe nothing's going to go wrong next year or the next 10 years or the next 20 years, but building that as an answer in permanence to an important global problem seems to me to hold perils that are almost unparalleled. You've got crazy people in the world, and I think it's pretty unwise jump into an energy system that produces that much bomb-grade material on an annual basis. Next broad category, very important one for what we're trying to do with Earth Day, is the environmental movement has not asked enough of its supporters. If you're an environmentalist today, what we really ask of you is that you chip in 25 or 50 bucks a year to some national organization, some state organizations, and they go pound on the members of the Senate and the members of the Assembly and try to pass some good laws, pass some good regulations, engage if necessary in lawsuits. And that's just not enough. It's not enough for a variety of reasons. Back at the time of the first Earth Day, there was a huge split between those people that got mobilized, between the folks that were the lifestyle folks and the folks that were the political folks. And they loathed one another. And I remember some of these debates and the passion that they generated. The political folks thought of the lifestyle people as complete freaks who all wanted to go up to New Hampshire and settle down on a commune and lead lives of absolute environmental purity and complete irrelevance. And the lifestyle people thought of the political folks as cigar-chomping Neanderthals who wanted to spend their entire lives roaming around the corridors of Albany, trying to influence a process, the whole objective of which is finding satisfactory compromises in a realm where many of the lifestyle folks thought compromise was not going to be satisfactory. You can't compromise a threshold. And the two fought it out, and the political folks won. The movement today is essentially a political movement. The tragedy of that is that there are huge impacts that we can make if we get people to take a look at those parts of their lives that are not particularly political. Take a look at what they do as parents, as consumers, as investors, as workers, as employers. If you go to the major manufacturers, get their most efficient model, and you eliminate the need for 12 large nuclear power plants worth of baseload generating capacity. You replace all of the incandescent bulbs that are appropriate in the United States with folded fluorescent bulbs, and you eliminate 22 large nuclear power plants. These things have huge impacts. We throw away enough aluminum every 3 months to replace our entire aircraft fleet. We throw away enough steel every year to replace all of the new vehicles, motor vehicles, cars that are made that year. We've got to get those changes made, not just the political changes, but the changes that we make as individuals in other parts of our lives. It's important for that substantive reason. It's also important because if you're really trying to build a movement that has the capability of succeeding with some very tough, painful, expensive new directions that we have to head if we're going to build a healthy, sustainable world, you don't build a movement by asking people to write out a check a couple times a year. You build a movement by asking people to do things. And in the early stages of the civil rights movement, people didn't send in checks to the NAACP to see if they could get some laws passed that would make it possible for them to ride up in the front of the bus. They stood up, walked up to the front of the bus and sat down and caused the world to adjust to that changed reality. They walked into lunch counters and sat down and got refused and came back the next day, got refused and came back the next day and got refused until finally even Lester Maddox took the baseball bat off of the accent, I guess it was, off of the wall and started serving them. They changed their lives, the world adjusted, the world was a better place as a consequence of that, and they were more committed to their movement as a consequence of that. We were more committed to our movement who did that sort of thing as a consequence of that. We haven't done much of that within the environmental realm. We need to do far more of it. For example, a group of us have put together the Valdez Principles for Environmentally Responsible Investing. So far, investment funds totaling, I think, something on the order of $65 billion have lined up behind these new principles, and as we move out to college campuses and into public sector pension funds and elsewhere, I think we're going to be picking up substantial additional amounts of funding behind pouring capital into companies that are behaving in an environmentally responsible fashion. I think it makes economic sense and investment sense to do that, but it also sends a very strong signal to the managers of the companies that this is where the nation wants to head. We're putting together an organization to create a seal, an environmental seal of approval for everything from detergents to light bulbs to what have you. An awful lot of people, you see these poll results and they range anywhere from 65% to 93, 94% of people who say, I would like to buy things that help protect the environment, but I'm just baffled. They don't want to get 40-page explanations of which light bulb to buy. They want to have something on it by some group that they respect that says this is the right one, or these are the right ones. So we're going to be creating that. And if those figures for people who are prepared to make those kinds of choices, if they're given the right kind of guidance, are right by even a factor of 4 or 5, we should be able to bring about a true revolution in terms of everything from the recyclability of the packaging of products to the environmentally benign life cycle impacts of the products, from the time that the materials are mined to the transportation, refining, manufacture, use, and ultimate disposal. Assuming that we can do that right, again, it's something that falls far outside all governmental realms. It's something where I think we can bring about profound, important changes in the way that we behave as a people. A tougher one. Many of you saw the article in this morning's New York Times where there was a condemnation of major national environmental groups by civil rights organizations for having inadequate minority representation within their staffs. The problem is deeper than that. That really reflects the problem. The problem is that they have inadequate minority representation among their members. We have inadequately reached out to diversify the environmental movement, and not just in terms of minorities. We haven't reached out aggressively to business, to labor, to the religious community, to farmers, to lumberjacks, to all kinds of sources constituencies that have a genuine stake in building the kind of environment that has a future to it. That's one of the things we're trying very hard to do with Earth Day. We've put together specific targeted campaigns for each of these constituencies and are, I think, mobilizing them very successfully. Some far more successfully than others, but particularly with regard to things such as the civil rights community, organized labor, and perhaps most importantly, the religious community. For the ethical dimension of this, I think we're beginning to show spectacular success in mobilizing them, getting materials into the hands of their members, getting sermons preached on Earth Day, which this year fortuitously falls on a Sunday. And I think we're going to have a major impact, but that's just sort of beginning to stick the toes in the water. What we really need to do is to build effective coalitions. We have to show members of these other constituencies why an audience that deals with the subject that this conference deals with shouldn't have the kind of racial and economic class makeup that this audience has. This group should be broader and more diverse. My organization should be far broader and more diverse. And to do that, we have to pick up ways that show we share your concern with a series of issues that are important to you and your members, and you ought to pick up some of our issues that are of importance to us. Probably the most important message that I'm to carry to you today is that of this vast array of new problems that we're settling down now to focus on, the brand new international environmental issues that for the most part have erupted into public consciousness only over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. Global warming, threats to the ozone layer, acid rain, ocean pollution, rainforest destruction, this whole battery of issues that no one country acting by itself can solve no matter what it does, that will require global cooperation. None of them are caused by sunspots, by earthquakes. None of them are caused by hurricanes. None of them are caused by some natural phenomenon out there beyond our control. Every one of them is a result of conscious human choices that we've been making as individuals and as industries and as governments. And we can make different choices if we have the will to do it. There is nothing at all bleak about our prospects at this point, and in fact, we may be at one of those inflection periods when this is one of the most promising moments in time, for a reason that may not be intuitively obvious. The reason that I'm most encouraged right now is because of what's been going on in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union and the opportunities that that presents. We are really, I believe now, seeing the winding down of the Cold War. We're seeing a part of the world that has been hugely destructive of its own environment coming to terms with the need to bring about important domestic changes in those areas, in their environments. I just came back from a tour that involved Leningrad and Moscow, much of Poland, driving all over Czechoslovakia, going to Hungary, talking to the major environmental groups in those countries, to governmental officials and others, and there is a robust enthusiasm to start tackling the problems that they have that I've never experienced in any of my previous trips to that area. I'll go off for a 30-second excursion about a drive I took through northern Bohemia of a valley around the town of Most that's 50 miles long, has a permanent thermal inversion over it. The entire valley floor is one big deposit of coal. It's high sulfur coal. We have something like 118 working coal mines in the region. 2/3 of them send their product by conveyor belts to the 10 coal-fired power plants in that valley. Of the 10 plants, there is only one that has pollution control equipment on it. It's Russian equipment. They bought it 7 years ago. It worked for 3.5 weeks. They've never repaired it. So you've got 10 large power plants spewing out what ultimately turns into acid rain, acid snow, acid sleet, acid fog, acid precipitation. You drive through the hills of that valley, and it's like driving through Dresden after the war. It's black. Every conifer for 50 miles on both sides of the valley has been killed, and they're just rotting away. Every fir, every pine. You can't live there without recognizing that what it's doing to those trees, it's going to be doing to a lot of other species, including our species. This is a part of the world that has not been receptive at all. In the 1972 Stockholm Conference, I talked with a few representatives of planned economies who pointed out that pollution is a consequence of unbridled capitalism. We don't have pollution in a planned economy. That's all been consigned to the dustbin of history. These people are now prepared to move aggressively. A guy who actually, I'm flattered to say, translated a couple of my papers a dozen years ago in a Samostat fashion in Czechoslovakia is now the Minister of the Environment. He's an atmospheric geochemist who's devoted the last 20 years of his life to studying acid rain. He's running the environmental department now, whereas he was constantly on the verge of being thrown into prison for the last 20 years. But the real opportunity is not just to start cleaning up that part of the world, it's the opportunity that the demilitarizing of that conflict may bring for us to do some different parts in our part of the world and elsewhere. And this is a simple resource issue. Last year, the world spent more than $1 trillion on war and on weapons for war. It is the overwhelming preponderance of all discretionary capital available in the world went into war and the preparations for war. The American budget for next year was now recently reduced from $305 billion to $295 billion for the Department of Defense. If we can start scaling down the tensions that exist between the two of us, if the troop reductions proposed by the President last night go into effect, if we start backing away from some of the crazier weapon systems we've been pouring this cash into, it really provides us with a unique opportunity to start making some of the investments necessary to build a sustainable society ourselves and to help other countries around the world invest in safe, sustainable systems. What should the people in this room have as their objective? It seems to me that this marvelous collection of talent, of intelligence, of energy and enthusiasm, and speaking at least of the table which I'm honored to be able to sit at, of power, has to do, because we're counting on them, is to design and implement a system that has one very important characteristic, that people within that society, acting in their own self-interest, will be doing things that are in the interest of the society as a whole. In the United States, that means tinkering a little bit with the price system. It means giving people the necessary encouragement to do things that make sense to them economically under the regime of prices that they're facing, but that also help the society build itself in a way that has a future. We saw a lot of this in the energy field a few years ago, when after the first Arab oil embargo, world energy prices doubled, and then after the Arab conflict between Iran and Iraq, they once again increased so that prices went over the course of about 5 years from about $3.80 a gallon to, I think they peaked out on the Rotterdam spot market at about $42. Huge, wrenching impacts on society. Once they settled into this range, though, of $32 to $34, suddenly a whole different set of very important, desirable changes were made. People started insulating the dickens out of their houses, investing in efficient furnaces, buying smaller automobiles, doing all kinds of things far more efficiently in ways that had beneficial impacts on global warming, beneficial impacts on our balance of trade, beneficial impacts in terms of reducing the rate at which a finite resource was being consumed, beneficial impacts in terms of the amount of fluid going through the channels of commerce in the world, and hence the probabilities of major oil spills. You can just chase out thing after thing after thing after thing, all of them desirable consequences motivated by people trying to adjust to this new price system. And perhaps not only people doing that, but institutions doing that. Businesses taking a look at the various factors of production that they can invest in, and suddenly finding that compared to labor, compared to investing in research and development, compared to investing in all kinds of other materials, energy was relatively more expensive. So where for decades we'd been substituting energy for labor, substituting energy for all of these other factors of production, we reversed that and started substituting other things, most importantly human creativity, for energy, and resulted for 10 years in this country moving spectacularly to produce more units of GNP per unit of energy consumed. With the fall of oil prices, a lot of that stuff just started falling apart once again. We abandoned the ratcheting up of fuel efficiency standards for automobiles, and a whole lot of people, once again acting in their perceived self-interest, but with a different menu of prices arrayed ahead of them, started doing things that began congesting our cities and increasing urban air pollution and doing all kinds of other undesirable consequences. What you are wrestling with in the natural resources area is a system that has come into place over the last century, designed in very large measure for the rapid exploitation, development of a virgin territory. We have all kinds of price incentives built into the transportation system, built into all kinds of other aspects of resource use that encourage the rapid development of new raw materials. That broad principle obviously gets applied in a variety of different ways, and the New York state government has already pioneered some important things in terms of the price advantages that it gives to using recycled papers in the procurement process for state government and the use of other recycled materials. And there are a variety of other important proposals currently in committee waiting to be moved on and to be implemented within the state. It's my prayer that in the course of building the kinds of enthusiasm around these issues that we're going to see in the next few months, will create a climate within which such legislation, which currently is running into some important vested interests, I mean, we're talking about massive changes in an important part of the economy, will have behind it the public muscle that makes their implementation possible. Final point is that people have focused a lot about the fact that this is the 20th anniversary of Earth Day, hence it was time to do it again. That's a nice press angle, but it has no real basis in reality. As far as I know, there is nobody, any place, who sat down and said, wow, coming up on 20 years, let's do it again. You can't do what we're doing with a random decision to go out and do it. I mean, it was claimed, and I believe correctly, that the first Earth Day was something like 4 times larger than any other planned event in history, where somebody sat down 6 months in advance and said, on April 22nd, we're going to do this, with no spontaneous thing around. It's not like Victory in Europe Day, where there's a vast outpouring that happens spontaneously, but a planned, organized thing. I think we were in a league by ourselves, and it would be very gratifying to believe that happened because my colleagues and I were by far the most skilled organizers that had ever jumped into trying to build an event. But it wasn't. What was important was timing. This nation was at that point prepared to jump in with this new set of values and to work hard on it. And all we had to do was drop crystals into what was a supersaturated solution in this huge, spectacular event involving people in tens of thousands of communities. All happened. The reason that it's happening around the world this time, why we've been able to put together planning groups in 122 countries so far around the world, is that the time is ripe. There are windows of opportunity that occur, and you can either take advantage of them or else you lose that window of opportunity. You see these issues come and go across the American spectrum. You saw the big concern with starvation in Ethiopia a few years ago, great preoccupation with problems of the homeless, huge concern about nuclear winter. All of these things come, they get an incredible amount of visibility, and then they go. I don't know, I think it started with Davy Crockett or hula hoops or something. We now refer to it as the Sesame Street kind of phenomenon. It's a short public sector attention span. We can't afford a short attention span around these issues. They require a long-term commitment, and they require right now that we supersaturate our society with these concerns over the next few months in a way that creates the climate that lasting change can be brought about. That won't happen because of anything that the 300 volunteers in my headquarters put into it, or that our paid staff puts into it, or that I put into it. We do our part. But it only happens if all of you are prepared to make the same kind of commitment. We want very much to get all of you who are part of this industry, who are part of your local governmental groups, who are educators, who are environmental activists, and the rest of the components of this audience to jump in and be part of it. We had a glitch, and I will close on sort of a mechanical note. We had a glitch in that I was supposed to have 1,000 things here to hand out to everybody, and as I understand it, those 1,000 newsletters/brochures didn't show up. For those of you who are not currently involved in local Earth Day organizations or in your state or regional organizations, I'd like to close by giving you a post office box that you can write to, and we would be happy to work with you, put you in contact with the people in your neighborhoods who are doing things, and if any of you would like to be involved on the state, regional, or national level, we'd like to find things for that as well. The way to reach us is Earth Day 1990, Post Office Box AA. It's the letter A twice. Stanford University, California 94309. It's Post Office Box AA, Stanford University, California 94309. I think we've got an unprecedented window of opportunity available to us at this moment. If you'll step into it, I think we can win. Thank you very much.
Moving at a speed equal to a slow walk, the cars are fed over the hill and roll on their way to new locations in the vast classification yard. The hump, as its name suggests, is an artificial hill which gives the cars impetus to roll to their proper locations. Safety is highly important on the railroad, safety for employees and safety for valuable freight. The routine of constant inspection and careful checking is never relaxed. At this pit on the hump, a skilled carman is constantly watching the underside of the cars for signs of trouble. Powerful floodlights aid his keen eyes in detecting needed repairs. A small defect may lead to a serious wreck if not caught in time. The inspector employs a unique system for marking a defective car while it is in motion. By turning a valve, he allows compressed air to blow whitewash on the truck frame. In a short time, the mixture dries, leaving a plainly visible white mark for the repairmen to spot later on. After marking a car, the inspector signals the towermen to route the car to the cripple track. The yard conductor is in complete charge of operations. His copy of the teletype switch list shows exactly how many cars are to be uncoupled as they reach the crest. Under his direction, the pin puller unlocks the coupler as the cars start on the downgrade. As the slack loosens the coupler pin, it can be lifted, and the car will start to move downhill under its own momentum. Air hose connections part without further attention. At the rate of about 3 cars a minute, it does not take long to classify a train. Before the introduction of the hump system, all car movements were made with switch engines. This was slow and expensive, as well as dangerous for switchmen. Today, such methods would be entirely inadequate to keep up with fast freight schedules. Livestock, dressed meat, poultry, fruits, and other perishable products cannot stand in the yards for long. Thousands of cars rolling in at one end of the yard must be kept moving out at the other end. Modern manufacturing methods call for close delivery schedules of raw materials as well as finished products.